Happy evening to all of you. This is Nandini Devi here from marketing team of Chrysalis. Let's welcome Mr. Sandip Anand today, who's the speaker of the day. He is from Becoming the Center for Mental Health. Many of you know, Chrysalis especially, with whom I shared with the profile of Mr. Sandip. For those who don't know about him, Mr. Sandip is the founder of Becoming Center for Mental Health. Is passionate about serving in the field of mental health. He had obtained a master's degree in psychology for mental health from the University of Edinburgh. After returning to India, he got trained to be a counselor to provide affordable mental services. He was earlier associated with the organizations like Thargam in UK and as a support practitioner. He also worked with another organization called FEELS at UK as a co-founder. Thanks for joining in, Sandeep. We are very happy to have you here. With that note, can you let us know all a brief about what this organization, Becoming Center for Mental Health, is doing and what are you aiming at in the future? We will be happy to hear that.
Yeah. First of all, it's nice to be here, and thank you for that introduction. Sort of really happy to be here. So I started becoming, I think, last year because once I finished my training as a counselor, I decided that I wanted to practice by myself and have this practice with supervision, of course. And started this largely because I had a certain idea for like accessibility. Like a lot of therapists out there do charge quite a lot, so I was trying to keep my rates affordable as well. The idea for becoming itself, like the word becoming, is from one of a psychotherapist that I really look up to called Carl Rogers. So his idea is that we're never sort of fully complete. Is that we're always in a state of flow, that we're constantly moving towards something, that he sees the process of life or of our actualization as something that is constantly happening, that we've never become but we're becoming. Um, so that's kind of the philosophy that I follow as well in my practice. The idea behind becoming is to maybe support others in achieving that process for themselves, and that is either through counseling, if they need that support. And I'm also trying to break into the field of mental health education, particularly in schools, where I want to make mental health a standard in the curriculum.
That's interesting. Thanks for the detailed introduction. Sandeep, it's over to you. Probably we are looking out for an interesting session on especially awareness in the area of mental health. Thanks for that.
Mhm.
Please, yeah, take it
Yeah,
up.
thank you. Hopefully, it will be interesting. Yeah, so it's nice to have everybody here today. And, broadly, what we are going to be looking at is mental health, and like just maybe conceptualize it a little bit better, or maybe from a different perspective. And also talk about a little bit about what counseling is and it isn't. Yeah, well, before we sort of go into it, just to see what we will be looking at today is, conceptualizing mental health for itself. And also, crucially, maybe differentiate between mental health and mental disorders, because they're not quite the same thing. Then we'll look at what we can do if, either we or someone we know is suffering from mental health issues. And the last thing we will look at is like counseling, and maybe a little bit about like definition and what happens in counseling. So if we can put this down in the chat, like what's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say someone has a mental health issue? Like just like pop in like a few words that comes to your mind. Yeah, stress. Okay, it's a common one. Depressed. Is not able to cope with something. Okay. Depression seems to be a common. Anxiety and depression. Seeking help. Anxiety again. Yeah. So what we usually drives our idea of mental health is what we see out there in media, and the most common disorders are anxiety and depression. That's kind of what we hear a lot, and along with stress and yeah, mental disorders as well. Thank you for saying that. Uh, but mental health isn't quite just that. We'll see that in a bit. One of the few things that people do say about mental health is that that we're making too much of it. That suddenly there's a lot of talk. Everybody has a mental health issue, or everybody has a mental illness, and they say it's all in your head. And for that, if you've already seen the sneak preview of that slide, is I have Dumbledore coming in and saying, well, of course it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it is not real? I think he says this in the last book when Harry Potter sort of stuck at King's Cross Station after he's killed by Voldemort. And then he asks, where am I? Like, am I dead or am I alive? Or is this experience just happening in my head? And Dumbledore says this. And that's true with most mental health issues as well, is that when we dismiss it saying that, it's just happening in your head, that's not really a dismissal, but sort of a fact is that it is happening in your head. And that's what makes it all the more real because anything that we experience, either in our bodies or outside, is largely controlled by our brain, which is one of the most vital organs that we have. It controls pretty much everything else in our body and how we experience the world. And that's sort of the organ that is implicated largely in mental health issues as well. And coming to like what the WHO defines about mental health, someone did say it's, the ability to cope or not being able to cope with something. That's one of the aspects of mental health as defined by WHO. And also, they say it's a state of well-being where an individual realizes their own abilities and can cope with the normal stress of life, work productively, and contribute to their community. So they have five different aspects. To break that down a little bit, like they say it's a state of well-being, but what well-being is very subjective to an individual. But generally, it means being okay socially, emotionally, and cognitively or psychologically. And realizing their own abilities is the aspect that talks about how we see ourselves and how we regulate ourselves. Are we able to sort of have an accurate representation of who we are, recognize our abilities, be able to exert our abilities, have the motivation to do so? Coping with the normal stresses of life is that inevitably we all face some sort of stress, either through our work, our relationships, with family. Are we able to deal with those things and keep having those experiences again, keep having life experiences again? Um, the fourth aspect, can work productively, is a bit, I think, controversial because I do not think that they mean in a very capitalistic sense of the word of the word productivity. I'd like to interpret it as being able to do what you like to do. Be productive with the things that you want to do. Be able to follow your dreams, your passions, your aspirations, and also meet the things that you do need to do to make a living. Right? Um, the last one, contributing to community, is not talking about charity or going off there and doing goodwill work or volunteer work. It's sort of being in public spaces in the way that we want to, having the relationships that we want to, and building our own social groups and having a constructive and positive relationship with those social groups, and also getting something from those groups that benefit us. And quickly before we go on to an activity, I just wanted to introduce sort of different domains of mental health, some which we might not immediately think of when we talk about mental health. Um, the first few on the left, mental health literacy, attitude, and self perception, they sort of talk about ourselves and our relationship with our mental health. Are we aware of what mental health is, how our mental health is? What do we feel about having a mental health issue or not having one or others having it? How do we see ourselves and our values and our abilities? And then, like the next few domains talk about our level of performance, whether it be cognitively or academically or occupationally. And then the next domains talk about the way we sort of regulate our emotions, our behaviors, sort of keep ourselves alive generally and well. And then they talk about the other category is our social skills, like are we able to maintain the relationships that we want to maintain, or sort of distance ourselves from the relationships that we do not want to maintain? Are we able to have a healthy relationship with family and our friends? Um, and the last few categories sort of talk about our like other aspects of our health, like our physical health and our sexual health, and our philosophical health. Like, do we have a purpose in this life? Do we see meaning to our lives? Do we see meaning in our existence? And that sort of really impacts someone's mental health when they can't see what they're living for. And the very last one, quality of life, just talks about ourselves in relationship to our environment, whether it be a political scenario or our essentials. Like, do we have fresh water, food? Do we have the financial stability? And uh, these 14 domains sort of serve to completely maybe compartmentalize and understand mental health. So using this, can we quickly in the chat, if you can, just frame a sentence as to what good mental health means for us, like what it means to you. I'll go back to the previous slide and you can maybe pick out the domains that sort of most stand out to you. And you can start sentences, for example, with the example that's on screen. Like, for me, good mental health is, and then maybe list out a few things and we'll see what comes up. I can see somebody saying being happy and at peace with anything you do. For me, good mental health is when I'm physically fit and stress free, able to manage my relationships well. It's the ability to hold inner peace and having quality thoughts. Those are some good ones. I'm gonna like steal a few of them for my next seminar. Yeah, peace of mind seems to be like a recurring theme for most of us. Having resilience, you mean, and not be disturbed by external factors. It's your kids, that's beautiful. Inner peace and feeling worth. Yeah, we sort of have like the idea of inner peace sort of encompasses most things in that domain. Is when we have those things, we do tend to feel the sort of content and we're not really struggling with most things that we do. So that sort of encompasses accepting things as is around us, having a positive frame of mind. Well, thank you for that. Those are some really nice answers. It's nice to read. Also, do let me know if I'm talking a bit too fast. I sometimes tend to forget how quick I can say words. Okay. So, well, moving on, we're sort of in the next part of our presentation is maybe talking about the difference between mental health and mental disorders. Does anybody want to come in on chat and let me know a few differences? Um, or if they're the same thing, feel free to say so too. If you think they're the same thing, then that's perfectly valid opinion to have. Okay, it's a medical term. Okay. Anything else? Anybody wants to add to that? Okay. So when people usually talk about mental health, we sort of think of this is that we have good mental health. Something happens, and then like our mental health gets progressively worse, and then we end up getting diagnosed with a disorder or a mental illness. Well, in the past, like this is mainly the conceptualization that we had. But around like early 2000, in the Midwest, a team of researchers led by someone called Case, they were sort of intrigued by the idea that a lot of people who did not have a diagnosis were still not quite happy with their lives. Like they were feeling quite miserable, but did not meet any diagnostic criteria. And they call this languishing. Like they were really languishing, even though they did not have any diagnosable illnesses or disorders. So then they did like a large scale research and found that like people with a diagnosis of depression, for example, were still sort of happy with their lives, whereas people without a disorder or depression were not quite so happy or content or did not have, as we frame, peace of mind. So then what they thought would be a better model is that they came up with something called the dual continua model, which is sort of conceptualizing mental health and mental disorders on interacting but sort of different axes. Um, so what this helps us do is that it helps us sort of think about mental health and disorders separately. So, for example, if we're thinking about like the top right quadrant, that seems pretty obvious to most of us. Is that when somebody does not have a mental disorder, you expect them to have good mental health, right? But what is interesting is that sometimes somebody without a diagnosis can have poor mental health. Um, an example for this is like, let's say we recently lost someone that we love. To expect us to get up for the next few days and live as we normally would is sort of unrealistic. Is that we are going to feel quite terrible. We are going to feel miserable and this lack of motivation. We're not going to be able to sleep properly. We're not going to be able to enjoy food or even want food. So that's a scenario where we don't have a diagnosis or a diagnosable disorder, but we still have poor mental health. The quadrant C, like on the bottom left, is again pretty sort of intuitive, right? Like you expect someone with a severe mental disorder to have poor mental health. But what quadrant D sort of signifies is that good mental health is possible for someone despite a diagnosis, that with treatment and with support, they can feel better. Like sort of conceptualizing some people on just one axis sort of dooms them, right? Like when they have a severe mental disorder, we're saying, there's no chance for you to have good mental health. But sort of this conceptualization puts into perspective that people with diagnoses can also have good mental health. And that's, for example, let's say in my previous work, I worked with people with schizophrenia and quite severe symptoms as well. But most of them were able to sort of work with it, with their disorder and its limitations and live fulfilling lives. They could do the things that they enjoy, have relationships, have, meet their families and enjoy that time. So it is possible for someone with like a severe disorder to also enjoy good mental health. And to think about mental health itself, something that happened in like the not early, late 70s is this guy called George Engel was sort of disappointed with like the biochemical model that was largely practiced within medicine and psychiatry. He said, it's not quite sufficient that we just think about mental health as something that's happening biologically or chemically, but rather we need to sort of think about the psychological factors that are in play and the social factors that are in play, like the environment that the individual is in, because those things also have a large contribution when we're talking about someone's mental health. So this is a model that we use today, especially in the field of psychology, to conceptualize mental health, either for ourselves or for our clients. We call it the biopsychosocial model or the BPS model. So here the biological factors could be, your sleep, your diet, your hormones. How are they functioning? What are your genetics? Do you have any inherited risk from your parents? Um, and do you have any other sort of physical illnesses or physiological illnesses that might impact your mental health? Psychological factors would include, the way we regulate our emotions, the way we think about ourselves, our self-esteem, for example, our cognition, like is our attention, memory, our perception, are they all working okay? Um, and social factors talks about, our relationships with others around us, with society, uh, and cultural factors and traditional factors, religion, and even our economic context plays a part, like and the political climate of where we are, like are we facing discrimination for our social identity? So those things also play a part in our mental health, and usually any sort of mental health issue has these three components, and there are factors in all three aspects that we do need to consider, uh, while conceptualizing and while treating. Before we go on to our next section, I just quickly want to show you this clip. It's from this TV show called Flowers. It's a British TV show, it's one of my favorite TV shows. It's about Mr. Flowers who writes kids' books, and he has an assistant who's from Japan, and he's his illustrator, but also does like odd jobs around the house. So Mr. Flowers suffers from depression, and it's reached a point where he can't quite keep it with himself. Like it's sort of manifesting in his ways that's hurting his family, and he wants to talk to his family about what's affecting him and his experience, but he finds that really hard to do. So he confides in his assistant Shun, and sort of asks him what he can do. And Shun has a brilliant analogy that we can maybe sort of use for ourselves. I will talk about the video quickly just so that everybody sort of here and has access to what I wanted to say there. So what happens in the video is Shun says, life's like a toilet, and sometimes you have such a gigantic poo that you sort of block the toilet, and you're ashamed that the toilet's blocked and you can't unblock it yourself, And it's embarrassing to ask for help, to have somebody else come in and look at all that's happened there and sort of help you with that. But unless we do ask for help, right? Like a plumber comes in and helps us unclog that toilet's going to be stinking. It's going to be, sort of impacting us negatively as well. And so Sean says, the first step is to maybe handle that shame and then reach out for support so that, at the end of it, we have a clean toilet and, then we can start again. It's it's a very funny analogy, but not the greatest of analogy. But I really like it because it gets the conversation going in a funny, silly sort of way. What I wanted to say was one of the first things that we do experience when we're trying to seek help for mental health, and this is me as someone who has suffered from mental health issues and as a counselor, is that there's a lot of shame attached to it. There's a stigma around it, and there's neglect around mental health that needs to be addressed first before we actually start talking about seeking any sort of support for mental health. But I will talk about shame and stigma a little bit later. But what do we do when we do want to support ourselves through mental health issues? Well, generally, the first step is to maybe recognize and accept that we are suffering from a mental health issue. And maybe if we can try and understand it for ourselves, maybe wrap our heads around it. What really helps is being able to verbalize it. Now, this doesn't have to be with somebody else. You could just maybe write it down on a piece of paper, make a note in your phone, or draw it if you can. But sort of being able to conceptualize it for ourselves, to see it for ourselves, and sort of be like, oh, so that's what it is, And then once we have that in place, we can sort of start maybe thinking of ways we can get past what we are facing, or sort of maybe coping with what's happening. But like just as in medicine, like prevention is better than the cure. It's sort of being proactive instead of reactive when it comes to our mental health. We don't have to wait till something pops up for us to then take steps to tackling our mental health issues, but rather, you know, start, working on our self care, have little routines, take care of ourselves, stop being self critical of ourselves, build support systems well in advance so that when we do inevitably face a mental health issue, we do have those resources in place that we can lean on. And if these things are sort of not being sufficient, or we want something above and beyond that, then professional support, you can seek the help of a counselor or a counseling psychologist or a clinical psychologist. Or if it's a mental health disorder that you are needing help with, a psychiatrist is also an option. And what can we do when we want to support someone we know with mental health issues? Well, the first step is the same, is recognizing the signs and starting conversations once we see those signs. Now, some of these signs could be something as simple as like a friend having like frequent mood swings or not showing up to places that they used to, maybe not being interested in the activities that they initially used to enjoy, maybe a shift in the tone of your relationship. And it's okay to always start conversations around that, ask them what's happening, but also be conscious and aware that you're asking not for your curiosity, but to sort of help them have that space, to create an environment where they feel comfortable sharing. And we can do this through like active listening instead of, again, like maybe sort of overly sharing about ourselves and hoping that makes them feel comfortable to share. Maybe take a step back and just give them that space to talk about it. Our questions that we ask should be geared towards, helping them share, like helping them have that sort of feeling that, this person is genuinely wanting to support me rather than this person wants to sort of probe and understand me better. That sort of helps. And again, exercising self-care here means something slightly different. Is that we want to be able to take care of ourselves while we are supporting someone else. Is that when we're feeling drained or don't have the energy or the space to support someone else, be honest with them. Let them know, I'm not feeling too great myself right now. Is it okay if we talk about this tomorrow? Can we do it over the weekend? Because I really do want to support you, but it's just that I'm struggling myself at this point in time. Another thing that you can do for someone is signposting, is gather resources for them, let them know what help is out there. If you can, get numbers, get links, and give it to them so that it makes that process of contacting professional help a little bit easier. And the last thing is supporting them through professional support. Is that our sort of role as supporters or friends or family members is not end when someone goes into counseling or therapy or seeks medical help. Is that if we can and if we're able, is to support them through that process. Oftentimes people do find it helpful to talk about their sessions afterwards with a friend, just so they have another perspective, or sort of just to help them process the counseling session itself. So we could be there in those sort of ways for others. So I have three terms on the screen. I've largely used the term counseling because that's the term I'm most comfortable with. But we usually talk about counseling, therapy, and psychotherapy and use these terms interchangeably. Now, in the chat, can somebody maybe tell me if there's a difference between these terms? Do they all mean the same? Or if there's a difference, like what is the difference? Well, yeah, so the thing is, it's confusing for even people in the field because, people use these terms interchangeably according to like the geographical location as well. Like what is therapy here is not what therapy is in the US. But largely counseling therapy and psychotherapy stand for some kind of talk therapy is what we say, is where you meet another person and talk to them and discuss with them about something that is happening to you. Um, the term psychotherapy and therapy are sometimes used for maybe longer term, more structured treatment, especially in the Indian context, and for treatment for mental disorders or illnesses. But the term counseling is used more loosely, where we're just helping someone else with relationship issues or work issues or marriage issues around marriage and stuff. That's maybe a difference that is employed in the Indian context. Now, quickly before we talk about what counseling therapy or psychotherapy is, I want to talk about what it isn't. And there's a lot of like sort of ideas floating around, especially on social media, about what is therapy. Now, iced coffee is cheaper than therapy. Probably yes, but it's not therapy. Neither is traveling. Like traveling is a good sort of experience to have. It, it it really isn't what therapy is. These two things can sort of feel therapeutic, but they can feel great and make you feel elated, but they don't actually substitute therapy. The last thing, which is very common in like at least the context of Tamil Nadu, is like listening to Ilayaraja music in the rain is therapy for me. Well, yeah, it's great. I love Ilayaraja myself, but like it's not really a substitute for actual therapy or counseling. Um, So quickly to define what counseling is that it's a process where a person facing a personal or psychological issue invites another, usually a professional, to form a relationship that is helpful. And how this can be helpful is from the client's perspective, is that it can provide an empathetic workspace that clients can use, is that they can share and explore their experiences without feeling judged, and sort of have someone who sort of understands them and validates the experience. They can also use like therapy can be useful as an interpersonal learning experience, is that clients can come in and learn different ways of relating with themselves or with others around them. Clients can use counseling for co-constructive dialogue, is that when two people do talk about sort of deep and intimate feelings and thoughts, is that there can be some sort of learning that happens there. New perspectives can be taken, and sometimes clients find that helpful. Counseling can be used for structured exploration and sort of to generate your creativity. And creativity is not just in terms of art, but like problem solving requires creativity. So if you're maybe stuck with something that's happening in your life, like counseling can be a good way to explore what is happening or what has happened and how to sort of work around that, use your creativity sort of find solution or tackle that issue. And counseling can also be used to sort of gain skills and like have some sort of guided learning. And this is maybe in the realms of maybe clients come in and want to feel a bit more assertive, maybe have better stage skills or presentation skills. And clients can use counseling for that as well. I skipped one slide in the back, so I'm just going to go back to that. And this is again what isn't counseling or therapy. One of the frequent myths or false narratives that we have here is that you go to a counselor and they're going to give you advice or suggestions or solutions, off the bat. Like, you say something and the counselor immediately has something to say, why don't you try this? That's largely what counseling isn't. Most ethical counselors and therapists would stay away from giving advice or suggestions because it isn't helpful to the client, because it comes without understanding the client's context and sort of demeans the client's ability to find solutions for their problems themselves. It's because they've been struggling with something for like so many years, and then you just immediately have something to say for that. It's sort of undermining that the client's skills or abilities. Counseling isn't an insightful conversation with friends. It can be helpful, like you can learn a lot from people around you, but it doesn't replace counseling or therapy. And it certainly isn't guidance from people with power or experience. Like your boss might have great suggestions or guidance for you to improve your career, but if you're having anxieties around your career, like your boss can talk from a place of experience. But in counseling, what we would explore is why those anxieties exist in the first place. When did it start? And how is it manifesting on an everyday basis? And how can we substitute that with something that's helpful, like a belief that's helpful? And the last thing is what we looked at is that activities that might feel therapeutic aren't actually counseling or therapy themselves. Okay, so who can provide counseling? Again, this is a very hot topic in India, is that a lot of people just claim to be counselors or clinical psychologists without qualifications. And there's sort of largely four categories of who can offer help. So clinical psychologists largely work within clinical settings with mostly mental disorders. They work with formulation, diagnosis, and like a standard treatment or long-term treatment. Counseling psychologists tend to work with people with everyday, day-to-day issues, usually like social or relational issues, and maybe also with less severe psychological problems. Counselors sort of do exactly what counseling psychologists do, but in sort of varied settings. For example, religious counseling is a thing, is that in the church you can go and talk to a counselor, and they offer help not from strictly from a psychological perspective, but from a spiritual, philosophical, or theological perspective. And a lot of people find that really helpful. Counselors are also employed in schools or work settings to work with very context-based issues. And the last category is psychiatrists. They're usually medical doctors. They need to have finished an MBBS and then an MD in psychiatry. Psychiatrists are the only specialists among these four who can prescribe medications. So if anyone else is trying to give you medications, they're not being ethical and they're also being immorally not strong. So psychiatrists can prescribe medication. They don't strictly offer counseling a lot of the times. They do have some counseling skills, and usually they would refer you on to either a clinical counseling psychologist or a counselor, so that you can sort of have both aspects of treatment at the same time. The last thing I do want to share is a quick slide, which I'll also send later, for resources if you are thinking about seeking professional help, or if you need help with crisis situations. So I'll share that slide later as well, so that you can have access to it. And that brings me to the end of my very fastly or quickly delivered seminar. So if you have any questions or clarifications, I think we can have that now. Or
Sure.
one last slide, like shameless self-marketing, is that you can reach me on Instagram at becoming.cmh, or send me an email if you have any sort of questions or clarifications around mental health, or text me on WhatsApp on that number on the bottom. If you want to scan that QR code or take a quick picture of it, you can. That just leads to my website, where I also have a blog. Yeah. So the first question that I did get was it's how to overcome challenges, especially when we lose hope in particular things. Well, this is an interesting one. Like challenges are challenges for a reason. They sort of test our limits, and they are sort of at the edge of what we can do. So, like physiologically speaking, our brain sort of plans to sort of spend a certain amount of resource. Like running our body is an intensive activity. So when we're at that limit of what we can achieve, our body sort of tends to say, what, maybe spending our resources here isn't that wise. What if we spend it and it doesn't pay off? Right? From a strictly survival basis, it doesn't make sense. So we do need to sort of fight against that idea that and say, maybe I do have the resources, and spending that resource here is worthwhile in my pursuit. In terms of hope, and losing hope, I'll quickly introduce a theory by this psychologist called Snyder. And he says hope is like a positive motivational state that has two components to it. One component is like it's called pathway thinking, and the other one's called agency thought. So in pathway thinking, like the aspect of pathway thinking in hope is that once we've set a goal, like or a challenge that we need to sort of get over, the pathway thinking aspect of hope helps us plan how we can do that. Like it says, we do this, and then then we'd probably over that barrier or we cross that challenge. The other aspect is called agency thought, and that's sort of recognizing where we can exert our control, our agency over this problem, and our ability to use that pathway that we've created to achieve our ends. And usually, what happens when we face a barrier or a challenge or we lose hope is that we lose that sense of agency in ourselves. We maybe think that we don't have it in ourselves, or we don't quite have the skills yet. So if we do lose hope, there's two things that we can work on. Is that maybe looking at our pathway and seeing, do we break down our goals into smaller, achievable goals um, so that there's a more clear pathway to getting over our challenges, or have we lost that agency, our sense of belief in ourselves, and how do we get that sense of agency back? So these are sort of two pathways that you can take to maybe get that hope back and reach that challenge. Another thing, especially with like goals, like what part of challenges is setting a goal that you want to cross, and it helps to set very clear and concise goals. Especially with research around psychotherapy, what we have found is that when people set goals that they can easily sort of say, like in a sentence, they find it easier to achieve and it's easier to conceptualize what the endpoint is. And also, people find it like outcome is better if we set goals that we're approaching rather than avoiding. A simple example would be a goal saying, I want to be happy with my work, rather than saying, I want to avoid stress in my work. It's because when we say I want to avoid stress, there are so many pathways you can take to avoid that stress. So it becomes very complicated to think of. But when we're saying, oh, I want to be happy with my work, you can clearly define one pathway to achieve that and stick to it without bothering about too many other pathways. This one doesn't work, then you can switch to the next one. Whereas the other one is a bit more cognitively demanding. I hope that sort of answers the question. If it was a bit unclear, I'd be happy to share something about Mr. Snyder's work on hope so that people can refer to it later. Okay, so I got a couple of questions around sleep actually. One of it was I find it difficult to sleep at nighttime due to different thoughts. How can I sleep peacefully? And the other question around sleep that I got was, what would be the reasons for disturbed sleep? And also an add-on question was how to overcome mental health issues. Well, to talk about sleep, what the research that is still very lacking. Like we understand that sleep has a relationship with mental health and mental disorders, but we're not quite sure exactly how that relationship plays out when it comes to different types of mental health issues. What we do know is that sleep has a bidirectional relationship with mental health. Is that when sleep is affected, mental health can be affected, and the other way around. When mental health is affected, sleep can be affected. In a lot of cases, what we do notice is that that is a pattern of poor sleep before a mental health issue or a mental disorder manifests itself. And this sort of disturbed sleep, like the reasons for that can be genetic or environmental as well. Like an environmental cause could just be there's too much noise in your surrounding or there's too much light. There's a lot of genetic factors that can also cause bad sleep. Any sort of physiological illness also affects our sleep. Um, a common sort of reason why sleep is affected, especially in like psychological aspects, is this idea of having racing thoughts or like unwanted thoughts, especially when we just lie down, like when we hit bed. That our mind starts racing. It starts thinking about all these things that we like along category, like we have trivial thoughts, or thoughts about why we aren't sleeping, or we have concerns about family or work, or like our future, or like preoccupation with our past, or like something that we're feeling in our body. So these unwanted thoughts can, well, largely be handled in different ways, and different things work for different people. But at least from research, one of the things that they found absolutely unhelpful was trying to suppress these thoughts. It's like saying, don't think about the pink elephant. And then what we do is we think about the pink elephant. So saying, oh, I need to sleep, I shouldn't have these thoughts isn't helpful. But what they did find helpful was maybe distracting yourself with a specific engaging activity instead. So yeah, you're trying to distract yourself, but you have a specific activity. For example, what really works for me is reading a boring textbook, or a very sort of manualized treatment plan. That sort of helps me not think about things too much because it's so boring. Like I'm trying to like focus on it, and it just puts me off in a bit. So find something that does work for you. If not, like another thing that research did find helpful was societal control, like talking about your thoughts with somebody else and sharing that, and sort of having that sort of shared commonality, knowing that you're not the only one with these thoughts, can help us sort of stop worrying about the thoughts that we're having. And by not worrying about the thoughts that we're having, by just letting these thoughts be, is that it might help us sleep better. One thing that can help with that is practicing mindfulness, or meditation. Mindfulness is like the intentional practice of having a lot of thoughts and being aware of these thoughts without imposing any sort of judgment on these thoughts. That, let's say you have a thought, we don't think whether that thought is good or bad, or what that implies about us. We just sort of have that thought and let it pass on to the next one. So maybe doing a mindfulness activity or a meditation activity before sleep can be helpful. To also sleep better, something that we do need to be strict about is our sleep hygiene. Like eating on time is does help. Like eating too late can impact our sleep. Instead of having a space where we're comfortable sleeping, that we're not uncomfortable or having pains when we sleep. Um, Technological disconnect before we go to sleep. This is something that I find super hard to do, is to not look at our phones or our laptops before we sleep, because that's a lot of stimulus, and our brains don't prepare for rest if we are exposed to a lot of light and a lot of stimulus. So maybe disconnecting from technology can help. Um, yeah, if there's more problems you are sort of having around sleep, talk to somebody who's a sleep doctor, an expert on sleep, and they can maybe identify what is actually going wrong, and then sort of maybe give you um, and try something that helps. Oh, the second part of that was how do we overcome mental health issues? Well, it's pretty similar to that slide that I had on supporting ourselves. Is yes, firstly, we have to be aware of what we are going through. We need to observe how that's manifesting in our everyday lives, what our experience is, and try to verbalize that. Exercise some sort of self care. Have a good diet. Try to sleep if you can. Like have some sort of discipline around sleep. Exercise, physical activity is a huge factor when it comes to mental health. And also, lean on our support system if we are struggling. Take the help of your friends, talk to them, talk to your family if you can. If you don't think you can do that in your immediate social circle, access professional help or support. The next question that I got was how to handle prejudice, which is disturbing the process of thinking. And an add-on to that is, are the glands, hormones, or DNA playing a vital role in causing illness of the mind? Well, prejudice of any form of discrimination is a real sort of hard one, because it's sort of built into our society. Is we find it hard to not observe discrimination or prejudice anymore. It makes us feel invalidated or inferior or invisible. It threatens our sense of self and our social identity. So it can be very hard to be comfortable with ourselves if we're in a space that is constantly sort of threatening our sense of self, our sort of idea about who we are. What we can try is, if it's possible, to confront that source. If it's a person, maybe have a conversation about what they're doing that's hurtful to you. If confrontation isn't a possibility, maybe trying to create distance, maybe trying to avoid contact with that environment or that space or the person. If that isn't possible, like if it's at work or somewhere that you can't escape situations where you're feeling discriminated or prejudiced, what we can then do is see where our control lies, and that's largely within ourselves, with our with how we think about what's happening or how we feel about what's happening. We can create sort of a cognitive separation, like create boundaries in our head. Um, we can, ask questions as why is this affecting us so much? When someone does something or says something that makes me feel prejudiced, why is it making me feel prejudiced? Like, what does it say about me? What does it say about my identity? Is what they're saying true? Do I have to take in what they say? Um, and once we sort of have maybe some reflections on those questions, asking questions like, what other sort of relationship can I form with this experience? How else can I, what other meaning can I find with this experience that is a bit more constructive to my well-being? If I can also add one more thing, the Greek philosopher, I forgot the philosopher's name, but a Stoic philosopher, and this is a common idea within Stoic philosophy, is that they say people aren't affected by events, but rather how they feel about these events, how they think about these events. So the same event can make different people feel different things or think different things. So we do have some sort of control over how we think about something. And when we change the way we think about something that's happening to us, we can it can sort of have a carry on effect in the way we feel and behave then. So if that's hard to do by ourselves, then seeking help of a professional would be great. Counselors and therapists, sort of, that's what we do, is that we work with your thoughts and feelings and see if there are other sort of thoughts that we can bring into prominence or other sort of feelings that we can have. The other part of that question was, are glands, hormones, or DNA is playing a vital role? And yeah, definitely. Like biology and psychology are very interrelated fields. The idea that the body and the mind are separate entities sort of died a long time ago. I think it started with like Rene Descartes, a French philosopher, back in like the 1600s. But it's sort of an extinct idea. What happens in our body affects the way our mind works, and what happens in our heads sort of affect our body again. Increasingly, you're finding that a lot of mental disorders and mental health issues have genetic components. There's also inherited risk. For example, I think if you have a parent with schizophrenia, the risk of you having schizophrenia is like 25 to 50%. If you have a sibling, I think the risk is 25%. If you have a twin who has schizophrenia, the risk is again 50%. So that is a genetic factor to almost every mental health issue and mental health disorder. Which is why we have the biopsychosocial model, is that we do consider biological factors as well. So my mind always keeps thinking of my work and personal commitments. It happened after COVID lockdown, and I feel insecure. I'm unable to have deep sleep, leading to various other health complications. How do I manage this? Well, it's the pandemic has been like something that we were never prepared for. Like, it's not something we talked about or expected. So I think a lot of us like found it really hard to cope with because we just don't know what to do when something like that happens. And with also like the idea of capitalism puts a lot of pressure on being productive and sort of always doing things and achieving things and ticking goals and stuff. So, and that's been hard to do during the pandemic, is that we find that some of our commitments with work and like our personal commitments were hard to complete. What can help is maybe sort of understanding where your responsibilities are, what your responsibilities are, prioritizing what's important and what isn't, and shedding some responsibility or sharing it with somebody else. Scheduling does help, and to feel and to, for yourself, it's very important that we intentionally schedule time to rest and for our leisure activities. And I'm not talking about time that we sleep or we eat. I'm talking about scheduling time outside of these two activities to sort of help ourselves sort of recuperate and rest and sort of regain our strength. And if, as always, like, do seek professional help if that is within your means. Because what I am giving here is very sort of general advice, which I hate, but without having too much context, that's the best we can do. Right. The next question is, why is mental health generally not given the same importance as physical health? If somebody gets physically injured, we go to a doctor and get treated, or at least apply first aid. We don't seem to do the same with mental health. Well, historically, mental health has always had a stigma because it's been poorly understood. It's largely because the etiology or like the conceptualization of mental health is quite complex. It's also abstract. It's in the mind, they say, and it's tough to understand what that mind really is. That we still don't have an exact definition of what the mind is. Um, in the past, it's mental health has also been sort of conflated with uh, uh, like the supernatural, or with like the work of the devil. And people with mental health issues or mental illnesses were seen as violent and psychotic and sort of dangerous to society. And that stigma has never died down. It's just sort of taken a different form now. Is that we do still hold some opinions about people with mental health issues, that they're weak, that they're unproductive, that sometimes they're just seeking attention. That's largely because with a physical sort of symptom, like with a broken leg, it's easy to see that what's happening with that person. And we sort of, when we see somebody hurting physically, we can see it, and it sort of triggers something in us to sympathize or empathize or pity them or sort of support them. But with mental health, with the stigma that is around mental health, it largely remains invisible and hidden. And when people suddenly start talking about, where, like, it doesn't match what I see, like, you seem fine, you were so happy at the party yesterday, but now you're telling me you're feeling depressed. Like, it doesn't match what my observations are, and that makes it harder for us to sort of deal with these two contradictory information that we have, and we maybe sometimes perpetuate that stigma. And we see this with a lot of celebrities who sort of suffer with mental health issues, and they come out like years later saying, I've been suffering with depression all the time. But we say, no, you seem fine. You act in movies, you play concerts every night, and you seem perfectly fine. But where is this happening? And it's harder to understand because largely it's hidden and it's invisible, the symptoms of mental health issues. And there's also neglect. So when I do realize, or we do realize that there's a mental health issue, is that we say things to ourselves like, that this is who I am. I always feel this way. I'm never that happy. This is who I am as a person. And that also prevents us from talking about it and seeking the support that we need. The next question is, what are some simple ways to improve mental health, and what would be the indicators of improving mental health? Well, simple ways. We can be mindful of what's happening with us. We can exercise something called self-compassion. Often, what I have noticed personally is that I'm very critical of myself. Like just earlier today, I was trying to wash dishes and I poked myself with a fork. And the first thing that came to my mind was, Sandeep, you're so stupid. How can you not wash a fork? How could you let like a fork hurt you? So, and then I realized that what I was saying to myself was really harsh. And what is behind my self-critical talk is this idea that I have of myself. Is that, I'm not quite competent with cleaning dishes. Is that I feel sort of incompetent there and feel lesser than what I actually am. I just made a small mistake, but I'm very self-critical with the way I am. And that's something that a lot of us do experience, is that we criticize ourselves in ways that we don't criticize others. We say things to ourselves that we would dare not say to our best friend when they're suffering. So a small way to improve your mental health is maybe changing the way we talk to ourselves. And again, like, take care of your physical health, your diet, your sleep. Do get some physical activity. And when I say exercise, it doesn't mean going to the gym. Walk, climb stairs every day. Uh, move around, dance if you feel like it. Anything that keeps you physically engaged is good. That's what I define as exercise. Also, tackle the stigma within and out with yourself, because that stigma can be sort of a real barrier in practicing the other things. Is that when we feel that shame around our own mental health, we would find it hard to exercise in any sort of corrective means or to make ourselves feel better. And build your support systems, and use your support systems. Um, yeah, and when the indication that you would feel better is that you would feel better. You'd find yourself being more open to experiences, maybe relating to people in the ways that you do want to relate, being fully yourselves, being authentically yourselves, coping better when there is inevitable stress, and generally feeling healthier physically and sort of psychologically. So the next question that I got was how to not get affected by so much negativity around you, and how to deal with situations where avoiding the source of negativity is impossible. I think this is sort of similar to the question that I answered before with the prejudice and discrimination. If you can't confront or avoid it, we need to create that sort of cognitive separation, recognize where our control is, and sort of minimize how much sort of space we give to that sort of adverse factor. And we can control what we pay attention to and how we process that information that we're getting in. And again, finding a different way of relating to what's happening and setting health like boundaries and enforcing those boundaries. An example for this is if somebody, like, you're driving on the road, you're being perfectly a good driver, somebody cuts across you and hits your car and then yells at you for being a bad driver. We sort of tend to dismiss that easily rather than when it comes from somebody who hurts us, because the meanings that we attach to somebody on the road shouting at us isn't something that's connected to our sense of self. Like when somebody says something bad about us on the road, we don't immediately say, "Oh, that must be true." Like that's what he means about me, that I'm incompetent, that I'm worthless, that I'm not a good driver. We don't make those inferences immediately, but when that happens in maybe more intimate or spaces that matter to us, we make those connections. That when we feel something negative or something, when someone says something negative about us, we sort of make those conclusions. Is that what does this say about me? Am I that kind of person? Am I sort of not who I think I am? So maybe reframing that might help. Um, uh, the next question is about my headache, someone's headache issues. I often have headaches when I'm traveling or driving in a car, and usually when this journey is long. Now, this isn't within my realm of expertise, but I do have those headaches as well, and I've narrowed it down to motion sickness. And if I do eat something before I do travel, I do have sort of bad digestive processes, and that doesn't make me feel so great, and I do have headaches. And also, like I find that using the air conditioner sort of it makes the car feel like a pressurized cabin, and that makes me sort of feel this weight in my head. So what does help me sometimes is to depressurize the car, like open the windows and have that pressure. Again, like I'm not an expert on headaches, so please do ask a medical professional. The next one is, how can parents help their children with sex education in a healthy way? That's a good one because this is something that's a taboo in our society, talking about sex. Um, a large part of the problem is that we did not have sex education in the past, which means our parents did not get that education or the benefit of knowing what that would feel like. So as parents, the first thing we would have to do is seek that education. Find resources that help equip us to have those conversations with our kids, and also to form healthy relationships with the idea of sex. I mean, we do as parents need to hold a healthy idea of what sex is and what sexual relationships are. So we need to first start on that journey ourselves. This we can do by talking to experts. And for our kids, what we can do is create a safe environment where they feel like they can share with you. um, Ideally, sex education shouldn't be the first intimate conversation that you have with your kids. Is that this is a conversation that you need to lead up to. Is that environment needs to be present where your kid feels comfortable sharing with things that happen to them, and go at a pace that is comfortable for your kids. Is that as adults we might find it easier to understand some of the concepts around sex, but kids find some concepts difficult to grasp. So maybe keep it age appropriate and think from the point of your kid, like from an 8-year-old or from 11-year-old's perspective. How can you give them this education um, in a way that they can grasp? Do not shame them outside of these conversations. Is that when they do say they have a crush on someone or are feeling funny about a girl or a boy in their class, do not shame them. Be open to that experience. Ask them what's happening there, and keep it sort of a dialogue rather than sort of probing or like a mentorship. Sort of keep that power sort of equal, that where you sort of speak from the place where both of you have equal power in that conversation. Be queer friendly, because your kids might not always be heterosexual or cis. Um, so have these conversations in a way that's inclusive and queer friendly. And also, well, boiling it down, just educate yourselves and be equipped before you have that conversation with the kids. How to deal with self-sabotaging. Well, the first thing to do would be to understand why we are self-sabotaging ourselves. It could be because either we have a fear of failure, or we sort of believe we're incompetent, and sort of to hide that, we sort of block ourselves from indulging in something, so that we can say, I didn't try, so that's why I didn't get it, rather than saying I tried and I failed, because that might say something about us that we don't like or believe. Once we know what is sort of happening, is to be brutally honest about the behaviors that are self-sabotaging, is to examine these behaviors and seeing what we can replace them with. Sort of procrastination, or sort of personalizing, or victim thinking, or sort of extreme modesty, even that's self-sabotaging behavior. Underestimation or perfectionism. These are some self-sabotaging behaviors that we need to be sort of brutally honest and say, this is what I am doing, and this is how I'm doing it. So what can I replace these behaviors with? and also work on changing the underlying beliefs we have about ourselves and our level of competence and ability. And importantly, sort of this will take time. Like self-sabotaging behaviors sort of build up over time and are sort of imprinted on us. So be patient with yourself, be compassionate with yourself, and give yourself that time to sort of overcome this. And the last question is a three-parter: is what are some food habits we need to follow to keep our mental health active? Uh, well, if you have specific food concerns, you need to talk to a nutritionist or a dietitian. But just generally, eat on time, have a balanced diet that meets all your nutritional requirements, and treat yourself. Eat the things that you like as well as not just have food that tastes bad just because it's good for the body. Is that once in a while treat yourself. Um, the next part of the question is after traveling, the mind becomes tired and doesn't respond to even simple questions, even though we know the answers or details. What is your recommendation? Well, I recommend like rest and self care. Is that traveling is quite sort of exhaustive because it physically and cognitively it takes a toll, because when we are outside in a space that's not familiar to us, we're sort of always on edge, always aware of what's happening, because that protects us and keeps us safe. And also, when we do take in new experiences, we don't consider new experiences being exhaustive, but taking in a lot of new stimulus also tires down the mind because we're taking in so much new information. So once you do travel, you need that rest. It's very understandable that you don't feel up for answering even basic questions or can't. It's the same as asking someone who's just run a marathon to solve a math problem. Like, even though they haven't quite spent their mind running a marathon, they're still physically so tired that they don't feel like they have the energy to do those math problems. So, rest. That's what I would recommend. And the last question, can you suggest some simple practices for me to make my mind more active? Well, generally, keep yourself cognitively and creatively engaged. Do the things that you like. Keep applying yourselves. Exert your creativity in ways that you find to be constructive and positive. Keep in touch with yourself and your experience. Be honest with what you're feeling, and share these experiences with others. Find something new about someone else. Talk to new people. Have conversations that you haven't had before. Learn new skills. Learn new languages. Our brain is very plastic. It needs to sort of keep doing things, keep repeating things to sort of solidify connections, and it can always form new connections. So form new connections in your brain by doing something that you haven't done before, and use its plasticity to the fullest. Um, yeah, and with that, I think I've answered all the questions that I've had.
Yeah,
I didn't
Sandeep, there
expect
is
it to
one
take so long.
question from
Yeah.
a participant.
Mhm,
The question is how to handle ourselves between home and work.
mhm,
Most of the time, I feel stressed to manage the both.
yeah.
Besides being a
Mhm,
mom of two toddlers, I feel exhausted sometimes. I'm losing myself, drowning into depression.
yeah.
Do
Yeah.
you want to
Being a
answer it?
mother. No, I also have it in my Q&A, so I
Yeah.
can look at it.
Okay.
So when especially, and this is a problem that's especially prominent for women, is that they're expected to deal with motherhood and work the same, and usually they don't find that support from their partners also. What we can do is acknowledging that this time is going to be sort of exhausting for ourselves, and you know when you're at work, it's hard to not think of your toddlers, but sort of creating something creating something in place that sort of ensures that your toddlers are safe at home while you're at work can be helpful. So maybe having someone you trust, like your partner, pitch in with some of the taking care of kids, and also maybe scheduling. If you can take maybe lesser workloads, if that's possible, do that, because inevitably toddlers are demand all your attention all the time, and they don't have a strict schedule. Like they don't decide at 6 o'clock I'm going to be hungry. So maybe if you can create that sort of flexibility at work, and also like support systems, like access them if you can. Ask your partner to help as much as they can. If you have parents who can pitch in, or neighbors who can pitch in, or friends who can pitch in once in a while, do that. And importantly, take time out for yourself. I know it's hard to leave kids at home and feel comfortable, but once in a while, have someone over, let them babysit, and go out, indulge yourself. Maybe treat yourself to a nice dinner, watch a movie, because you do need to rest as well. You can't pour from an empty cup. So make sure to take care of yourself as well. Um, it's very sort of general advice, but without knowing the specifics of what's happening, it's really hard to um, work on what you're going through. So if you do find the time and have the means to do talk to a counselor or a counseling psychologist, they might be able to help you plan your everyday more effectively. Maybe manage some of the thoughts, like the anxieties you will inevitably have around your toddler's well-being, and maybe slacking at work. So maybe dealing with those thoughts better could also free up some space and energy. I hope that sort of slightly answered the question. Like, obviously, the issue is more complicated than just a paragraph of text, so it's kind of hard to be very specific with the answer.
True, true. Yeah. Thanks
Yeah,
for that.
yeah, and there is a gendered problem here as well. Is that like parenting largely falls to the women,
Yeah.
right? And even if like the partner contributes, the responsibility is felt more by women.
True.
And maybe sort of the consequences of something going wrong almost exclusively falls on women. Right? They
True.
blame the mother if something goes wrong rather so those expectations and pressure can really weigh mothers down. So mhm,
Yeah, with that note, thank you from Chrysalis and people who had joined in. Bye bye.
mhm. Yeah, thank you for having me. And as always, you can always mail me questions. And I do apologize for going over time. I tried to rush as fast as I could, but I kind of underestimated how long this would take me. So thank you for staying beyond the planned time as well. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Nandini, for hosting and being such a
So,
kind and gracious host. Yeah,
so thanks are pouring in for you in the chat box.
grateful
Yeah,
to
bye
that.
bye
Yeah,
all. Bye bye. Have a great evening today. Bye bye.
yeah, you too. Take care. Bye bye.